Hello, my History 289 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. We're getting ready to start week 6 in the course here, so thank you for all those of you who've hung in over the last month, 5 weeks or so to get to this point. I just want to make sure that we're staying on the right track here in terms of what's going on in this course. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the week 5 discussion, what we're going to do week 6, and go on from there. Right now, we're really in this period of time where we're trying to understand what the work of historians is versus what people who are not in the field of history, who are not historians, not professional trained, or not academics, they don't have master's degrees and PhDs in the field and years of experience. Um, those expectations versus expectations of Joe Public, whether they happen to be powerful politicians or people who sit in state schools of schools of state education departments making decisions about textbooks, or whether they're school teachers. And by the way, a history teacher at a high school may or may not be an expert. There are so many people who I know in the field who are history teachers at the K-12 level who do not have training as professional historians. They teach the subject because it's something they have to do in addition to coaching the soccer team or coaching the football or basketball team. Or they might be a vice principal and they just have a genuine interest as a history buff, but they're not a historian. This is not a criticism, this is just stating actual facts. A lot of people who teach this stuff are not experts. And so when we get into things like talking about the notion of revisionism, a lot of you poo-pooed the whole idea of revisionism as if someone just looks at the literature and goes, hey, only people who've written about this stuff are white guys, so I'm going to go as a black guy and write about this stuff and present my different perspective, however biased it may be. It is not that simple. It is a lot more complicated than that. There might be holes in the literature because the only people who've written about it are white guys from New York City, or white women from France, or South Asians who um, were involved in massacres of South Asian Muslims during the breakup of South Asia between Pakistan, Bangladesh, which used to be called West Bengal, East Bengal, I should say, and India in 1947, the partition of the state of those nation states. Right, those are examples of ways where visionism could take a turn. But as I asked you all to think about, there's a difference between revisionism and propaganda. Propaganda is not attempting to use the tools that historians use in order to make a point. It's literally someone saying, I have a point to make, and I don't care about these tools. Matter of fact, I don't have to be a historian to do that. This is my opinion, and all opinions are equal and all of that. That's not much different than how the media thinks. That's not how much different than the average Joe, the Joe Sixpack thinks about these kinds of things, right? All opinions are equal, they're equally valid. There's no way to prove anything's right or wrong. No, there's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as sin, and so on and so forth, right? There's no good, there's no bad. It's all of that. There's a problem with that. For one, there's something called a historiography. That is to say, if there's any literature on a particular topic, you have to look at who the leading people are who are writing on this topic. For something like, say, slavery studies in the U.S., there are probably 300 books and maybe 1,000 articles that deal with issues of slavery from, looking at slavery in the U.S. from, say, 1890 to the present. You're going to have to pretty much decide that everything written prior to 1960s got a heavy bias toward presenting slavery in its most positive light, not looking at its brutality, looking at it from a perspective of white guys mostly, quite frankly, who would have been the slave owners. And moving to the 1960s to the descendants of slaves, looking at documents like the Federal Works Project and the Federal Writers Project, and their oral histories of then elderly folk who had been enslaved as black folk, and were born into slavery in the 1850s and 1860s, who were still around in the 1930s, right? Those examples that sort of change that feel. That's a revision. That's revisionism. It's not revisionism as practiced by is practiced by Joe Sixpack. It's revisionism practiced by historians, meaning we looked at this literature and said, this literature is way off. It's not really dealing with the experiences of those who actually were enslaved. It's not dealing with their experiences for how they managed to cope with this process. It's not dealing with their experiences for how they managed to break free if they escaped slavery, if they stole themselves into freedom. It doesn't deal with how they dealt with emancipation when it finally did come. It doesn't deal with, the fact that the Civil War was over slavery. You can say states' rights all you want. You can say it until you basically suffocate and die. But the fact of the matter is, states' rights to do what? To make sure that slavery remained, a way that, mostly white, almost exclusively white men could prosper. That's what slavery was about. That's what the Civil War was about. So, just to give you an example of what revisionism is, it's not, revisionism is just a term that's been coined by people like George W. Bush, and maybe you can throw in Donald Trump and other folks, and this is not being ideological, this is pointing out the fact, to basically say, stop investigating me, stop looking at things, trying to find truth here. There's nothing to find here. Our way we're presenting things is fine. You can call that propaganda, you can call that um, bad revisionism all you want, but it is what it is. So I say all that to say, be open to what historians actually do for a living. We're not sitting here making up stuff. I can promise you that. At least, the ones that I know, the person that I've been as a historian over years, we're not making up stuff. We're looking at the evidence. We're presenting it based on a combination of our experiences, the sort of, approaches that we've learned, the rationale behind it. Yes, there's going to be some bias. But not all bias is bad. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's good for the profession to have that bias, to have that edge to what you're doing. It's not good to just be purely 100%. I'm a computer. I'm data from Star Trek, Next Generation, objective. And even data is not 100% objective if you really think about it. His goal was to try to be as human-like as he possibly can while still maintaining some sort of his androidness at the same time. So if that's the case, then there's a bias there too. So there's always going to be some bias. The question is, can you get at some truth while maintaining that bias? And I would argue, yes, you can. Nothing's going to be 100% true for those who are purists. Sorry, and there's no such thing as purity in this profession. If you want to find purity, then I would suggest going to work for a diamond store or work for a jewelry store and look for 100% pure gold and 100% pure diamond. That's not going to happen with something that's a human science, that's art and humanities and science basically all wrapped into one. So that's it. This week we're basically dealing with the continuation of the issues from the last couple of weeks in terms of the kinds of history we have and how we manage the public and the private space as historians. And the truth of the matter is, most historians are not trained well to deal with the public sphere at all. The Enola Gay exhibit that you're going to be reading about is a very good example of this, where historians who are involved in this did not anticipate that there would be such a huge backlash to looking at the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian in 1994-95, and people going, how dare you say that we committed atrocities, that we committed war crimes, that we killed all these people. This ended the war. This helped save them, lots of American lives, and blah, 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 right? The truth of the matter is, as with most things in life, there are both ands, right? Maybe the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did save some American lives. Maybe it saved a couple 100,000 lives. Maybe it saved 1 million lives. But that would completely negate the fact that the Soviets invaded China around the same time that we were dropping the second bomb, and within a week had captured or killed 1.5 million Japanese soldiers. That might have had just as much of an impact of forcing Japan's hand and capitulating on August 14th and 15th of 1945. Maybe more so, actually, than an atomic bomb drop, since they didn't respond immediately to those. They didn't go, oh my God, when those two things happen, right? And at the same time, let's face it, when you incinerate targets that are primarily civilian, we're dropping one bomb that basically causes, 70,000 people to die instantaneously, and upwards of a quarter million people dying over 5 years from the effects of radiation poisoning, and you're poisoning the ground and the air and water and everything else. That's a war crime. It is by Geneva Convention, The Hague, however you want definitions. That's a war crime, right? And we would call that a war crime if it weren't the United States of America, and if it weren't um, World War II, right? Outside of that context, it's probably a war crime. And so the debate can go both ways, but I would argue that it's a both and, right? You can be happy that the war ended sooner than it actually did. You can be happy that American soldiers and sailors and service people made it home without having to invade Japan and lose their lives and limbs and so on and so forth. But you can also argue, well, still a war. There's the other side. It's still probably a war crime. So there's that too. So I just bring that up as food for thought. The other issue is really about gender history and looking at gender and dimensions of gender as historians. When most people hear the term gender history, and that includes a lot of historians, they think about women's history because most of the gender studies that have been done over the last, say, 50 years have primarily involved women and involved, misogyny and the sexism that women have faced throughout the centuries in the Western world and other worlds, right? And how do you study that? How do you study that in a contemporaneous sense? How do you study it going back through time? How do you study it looking at different cultures and so on and so forth? Your readings in general cover those things. But at least one of your readings, if not two, also covers the fact that, by the way, gender is not just about women. Gender is about men too. And that they're also, for lack of a better way of putting it, intersections between issues of gender with other issues, whether it be capitalism or racism, whether it be imperialism or colonization, whether it be you know the just adulthood and dealing with being the man versus the stages of life being the man versus stages of life being a woman, right? And of course, if you want to go further than that, we can bring up gender identity issues, although that's not in your readings, but it would be part of gender studies if you're looking at gender history within history within the context of gender studies in general. So, um, and so Jeffrey Glasgow, who also teaches at UMGC, at least as far as I know, I think he's still here, has written a couple of articles that look at the gendered history of sailors in maritime times, I guess in the 18th century. So maybe there's a little bit in there about the kind of work that sailors did vis-a-vis things like the transatlantic slave trade, but it's mostly about sailors' lives in general, right? Their diets, their manliness, that way they try to, exhibit manliness, and how the term manliness itself has changed over time, right? And now, in fact, since the second half of the 19th century, our notions of maleness have been very, very, very strict compared to what it has been in previous times. He does go over that. Some of the other writers talk about that as well. And that Western notions of how men are supposed to dress, what kinds of emotions men are allowed to express versus the kinds of emotions that we typically suppress, crying, for instance. Those kinds of things get talked about in some of these articles too. So you got a nice little hodgepodge. Your next couple, we're rolling into the last part of the semester, really dealing with just sort of hodgepodge issues, right? As far as your papers are concerned, I will grade them this week. Hopefully, get them back to you by Monday, maybe Tuesday. The end of the week at the latest. Other than that, that's it. Good luck. Have a good week 6.